There is a story older than Scripture, older than the oldest book you have ever held, older than the languages you have learned, older than the borders drawn on any map you have ever seen. It comes from a place where two great rivers once cradled the earliest cities of the human world, where people pressed their fingers into wet clay and left behind the first written words, and among those words, they left behind this, a story of water, of judgment, of one man who listened to a voice that spoke not to him, but to a wall. Close your eyes, if you wish. Let the sound of the world around you grow soft, and allow yourself to be carried, very gently, back to the beginning of memory. Before we enter the flood, we must first enter the land. Imagine a flatness so complete, so absolute, that the horizon in every direction appears as a single unbroken line. There are no mountains here. There are no great cliffs rising from the earth, no dense forests pressing against the sky. There is only the plain, wide, ancient, and threaded through with the slow movements of two rivers. The Tigris moves in the east. Darker, swifter, its waters carrying silt from far mountains that the people of this land have never seen. It cuts its path with a kind of purposeful quiet, always moving, always feeding the soil along its banks with the minerals of faraway stone. The Euphrates moves in the west. Broader, slower, winding in great curves across the plain as though it is reluctant to arrive anywhere too quickly. Its banks are soft and yielding. The reeds that grow there are tall enough to disappear into, tall as a man, taller, swaying together in the warm southern wind, whispering in a language that is not quite sound. Between these two rivers, and along their banks, and in the lowland marshes where their waters sometimes mingled and spread into shallow, reed-choked shallows, this is where the world began. Not the whole world, but the world as those earliest people understood it. The world as it was given to them. The Sumerians called this land between the rivers their home, and they understood it not as geography but as gift. The soil here was dark and deep and astonishingly fertile. When the rivers flooded in their season, they left behind a thin layer of silt across the fields, and from that silt, when the waters pulled back and the sun returned, grew grain in such abundance that it seemed miraculous. Not metaphorically miraculous. Literally, cosmically, divinely miraculous. Because the Sumerians did not separate the world into the natural and the supernatural. The river flooded because a god willed it. The grain grew because a god tended it. The sun rose in the morning because the great sky god, the father of the heavens, allowed it to rise. Everything that existed within a divine architecture. Everything that happened as part of a sacred arrangement between the gods who shaped the world and the humans who were made to serve within it. And so the cities grew. They grew slowly at first, as all things that last tend to do. Eridu was among the earliest, a settlement so old that the Sumerians themselves regarded it as the first city, the city given by the gods before all others, rising from the primordial marshland near the mouth of the rivers where the fresh water met the sea. It is said that the gods established Eridu in the moment before time was properly counted. That the plans for it were drawn up in the heavenly realm before the first reed was pressed into the first brick of mud. The city grew around a temple. This was always the way of things in the Sumerian understanding. The temple was not built to serve the city grew because the temple was there, because where a god dwelled, there was also order, and where there was order, there was the possibility of human life. The temple at Eridu was called the Abzu, named for the great underground freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, the source of all springs and wells and rivers. And it was here, in the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom, of water, of craft and intellect and the deep currents of things, that the sacred arrangements between gods and humans were first made explicit. Enki was a god of particular quality. Among the great gods of Sumer, he was the one who understood not merely power and had power, not merely authority. Enlil, the great air god, the god of wind and storm and the space between earth and sky, had authority enough to shake the world with a breath. But Enki had understanding. He knew the sacred tablets upon which were inscribed the laws and properties of civilization. Kingship, priesthood, music, craft, truth, descent into the underworld. All the structures that made human life coherent rather than chaotic, these were held in Enki's keeping. And from Enki's temple at Eridu, the knowledge of civilization spread. Other cities rose. Nippur, which became the religious center, the city where the great god Enlil kept his own temple, the Ika, the mountain house, a temple so sacred that even kings made pilgrimage to it. Bad Tibera, Larak, Sitpar, and Shuruppak, which would come to matter greatly in what follows, a city of moderate size, sitting along the banks of the Euphrates, home to a king whose name would be remembered not for conquest or for monuments, but for survival. Each city was, in the Sumerian understanding, the property of a specific deity. The god or goddess did not merely watch over the city from above, they owned it. The people who lived within it were, in a literal sense, the laborers of the divine household. They planted the fields to feed the temples. They built and maintained the sacred structures. They performed the rituals at the proper times, offered the proper sacrifices, sang the proper hymns. And in return, the god provided. The rains came. The rivers flooded at the right season. The grain grew tall. The city was held together against the encroaching chaos of the world beyond its walls. This was the covenant. This was the arrangement. And it was not experienced as oppression, it was experienced as order, as rightness, as the proper shape of things. In those early generations, the arrangement worked. The fields produced. The granaries filled. The temples were maintained with care and devotion. The cities thrummed with the ordinary music of human life, the sound of potters at their wheels, of weavers at their looms, of children running along the narrow streets between mud-brick walls, of hymns rising from the inner sanctuaries of the temples in the long evenings when the light turned gold and the heat of the day finally began to release its grip on the land. The gods were, for a time, content. But time moved. As it always does, whether or not anyone chooses to notice. Generations passed, and then more generations, and then generations beyond counting, because the early kings of Sumer were said to have ruled for spans of time that stagger the imagination. The ancient king lists, preserved on clay tablets, record reigns not of decades but of thousands of years. Before the flood, it is written, kings ruled for spans so vast that the numbers themselves feel like a different kind of truth, not historical record but mythological statement. An expression of the idea that in the earliest age of the world, time itself moved differently. That the distance between the human and the divine was smaller. That the world had a quality then that it would not have afterward. And in that long, slow passage of antediluvian time, humanity multiplied. This is stated simply in the ancient sources, and it is worth sitting with that simplicity for a moment. The people multiplied. The land filled. The cities grew from small temple communities into proper urban centers with populations large enough to require organization, administration, hierarchy. New settlements spread out from the old ones. The marshlands were drained, in places, to make room for more cultivation. The cultivated land pressed outward. There were more hands now to work the fields, which meant the fields could be expanded, which meant there was more grain, which meant more people could be sustained, which meant more people were born, which meant the cycle continued and continued and continued in that slow geometrical expansion that characterizes all growing things when conditions are favorable. And the conditions were favorable. That was, in a sense, the problem. The gods had done their work well. The world they had arranged for humanity was productive, sustaining, generous. And humanity, given generosity, had done what living things do. It had grown. The noise rose with the numbers. Here we must be careful with how we understand this, because the temptation is to hear it as metaphor, as though the ancient scribes were gesturing toward something abstract, something about the burden of civilization or the weight of human ambition. But the Sumerian texts do not seem to intend metaphor. The noise was noise. Literal sound. The accumulated sound of a growing population going about its daily existence. And Enlil could not sleep. Enlil was not a god who was easily disturbed. He was the god of the atmosphere, of the wind and the air and the great reaches of space between the solid earth and the turning heavens. His temple at Nippur was called the Mountain House, and he himself was often described in terms of elevation and distance, a god who stood apart, who looked down at the world from a remove. He was not warm in the way that Enki was warm, not close in the way that the grain goddesses were close. He was majestic and remote and, within the divine council, possessed of an authority that even in the sky god largely deferred to in practical matters. But Enlil slept. The god slept in the way that the Sumerians understood divine rest, not unconsciousness but a kind of sacred withdrawal, a turning inward, a cessation of active engagement with the world. And it was during these periods of divine rest that the noise of humanity rose most acutely, because the world did not quiet itself when the gods withdrew. The people continued. The animals continued. The cities continued their constant, accumulating, layered production of sound. And Enlil was troubled. The disturbance was not merely inconvenience. In the Sumerian understanding of cosmic order, there was a proper arrangement to all things, a correct relationship between the divine realm and the human realm, between the activity of the gods and the activity of people. When that arrangement was disrupted, when the balance was upset in any direction, it constituted a kind of cosmic wrong that demanded correction. What was happening was not, in Enlil's view, simply annoying. It was disordered. The noise of humanity had grown beyond what the original arrangement had specified or intended. The people had multiplied beyond the measure that had been set for them. And this excess, this overflow beyond the proper boundaries of the human place in the world, required a response. It is worth pausing here to understand that what was being contemplated was not punishment in any moral sense. The Sumerians were not, in this myth, telling a story about human wickedness or divine retribution for sin. The flood tradition in the Eridu Genesis and related texts is not a story about what the people did wrong. It is a story about numbers, about noise, about a fundamental tension between the growing presence of humanity and the equilibrium of the divine order. The people were not being judged for corruption. They were being judged, in a sense, simply for being too many, for having filled the world too well. Enlil brought this concern to the divine assembly. The divine assembly was the gathering of the great gods, the Anunnaki, the children of An, the gods who held authority over the major functions of the world. They met in the heavenly realm, in a space that the Sumerian imagination conceived of as formal, structured, hierarchical. There was a place for each god according to their station. There were rituals of speaking and of listening. The assembly was not a democracy, but it was also not the simple dictation of one divine will. There was deliberation, there was expression of different views, there was the weight of collective divine wisdom brought to bear on a question. Enlil spoke of the noise. He spoke of the disruption of his rest, and of the larger disruption to cosmic order that the multiplication of humanity represented. And he proposed what, to him, appeared as the necessary correction. The flood. The word for it in the Sumerian language is *amaru*, the great flood, the inundation beyond all ordinary inundation, the water that does not merely overflow its banks but erases the banks entirely, that does not merely flood the fields but swallows the fields and everything that grows in them and everything that stands above them. The assembly heard the proposal and, largely, agreed. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the story, when you sit with it in the stillness of the night, not that one god wished to destroy humanity, but that the assembly of gods considered the matter and found the proposal reasonable. Found it proportionate. Found it, within the framework of their understanding of cosmic order, correct. The decision was made. The flood would come. At a time appointed by the divine assembly, the waters above and the waters below would be released. The great storms would be sent from the four corners of the world. The river would rise beyond all rising. The cities would be returned to the mud from which they had been raised. The gods of the great cities, the patron deities of the places where people lived and worked and prayed, were instructed to withdraw from their temples, to abandon their posts, temporarily, and to allow what was to come. This was, in its own way, a kind of mercy. The gods would not have to watch over the places they had tended. And then the assembly dispersed. And the world, unaware of what had been decided in the divine realm, continued. The potters turned their wheels. The weavers worked their looms. The children ran in the streets. The hymns rose from the temples in the long evenings, and the light turned gold, and the heat of the day released its grip on the land, just as it had done for as many years as any living person could remember. But in the assembly of the gods, a weight had settled that could not be undone. Almost. Enki had been in the assembly. He had heard what was decided. And Enki was not, by nature, a god of simple compliance. His domain was wisdom, the understanding of how things worked, the recognition of possibilities, the perception of paths through complexity that might not be visible to those who looked only at the surface of things. He was the keeper of the me, the sacred principles of civilization, and among those principles was a love for the craft of human existence, for the intelligence and skill and creativity that humanity brought to the world it had been given. Enki did not disagree with the authority of the assembly. He did not rise in the council and argue against Enlil's proposal. He was, in this story, not a rebel. He was something more subtle, a god who understood that there are sometimes ways to honor the letter of an agreement while also finding, within that letter, a space that the agreement had not quite closed. The assembly had decided the flood would come. What the assembly had not precisely specified was that not a single living thing could survive it. And Enki knew a man. His name was Ziusudra. The ancient texts describe him in terms that make clear he was not an ordinary person, not in his nature or his devotion. He was a king of Shuruppak, one of those antediluvian rulers whose reign stretched across spans of time that we cannot measure in ordinary years. He was described as pious, as humble, as attentive to the divine, a man who paid careful attention to the dreams and signs that the gods sent into the world, who understood that the space between the human and the divine was not impermeable, that messages passed through it in forms that required patience and openness to receive. Ziusudra had been watching. He had sensed, in the particular quality of recent days, that something was shifting. That the divine attention was gathered around some decision he could not quite see. He had been performing his rituals with particular care. He had been spending time in the temples, listening. And it was to this man, this attentive, listening, pious man, that Enki chose to speak. But Enki was constrained by what had been decided in the assembly. He could not simply appear before Ziusudra and announce the flood directly. He could not openly defy the divine council or violate the shared decision of the Anunnaki. The agreement had been made, and Enki's integrity, his own divine order, required him to honor it. And so he spoke to a wall. This detail is one of the most remarkable in all of ancient literature, and it is worth sitting with it as the night deepens around you. Enki spoke to the wall of a reed structure, a hut, a simple dwelling, the kind of structure made from the tall reeds that grew along the riverbanks, cut and bundled and woven together into walls and roofing that generations of people in this part of the world had used for shelter. There is something in the choice of this, a wall of reeds, the most humble and temporary of materials, the stuff of everyday life in the marsh country, the raw material of ordinary human dwelling. The wall could not understand speech. The wall had no ears, no mind, no capacity to receive a message or act upon it. What Enki said to the wall was, technically, not said to any person at all. And therefore, technically, Enki had not violated the terms of the divine assembly's decision. But Ziusudra was there, close enough to hear, perhaps resting inside the hut, perhaps passing by on some ordinary errand, perhaps because he was who he was, attentive, listening, already sensitized to the possibility of divine communication. Perhaps he had positioned himself, consciously or not, in a place where such a voice might reach him. Enki spoke to the wall, and the words that he spoke carried everything Ziusudra needed to know. The exact words preserved in the fragmentary tablets of the Eridu Genesis have not all survived the 4,000 years since they were inscribed. There are gaps in the text, portions lost to time and damage, words missing where the clay broke or the inscription faded. But the shape of the message is clear, and it is this: the assembly of the gods has decided. A flood is coming. Not an ordinary flood, the one beyond all floods, the end of what has been. And then, nested within the warning, the instruction. A vessel must be built. Something large enough to contain not just one man but the seeds of continuation, because what Enki was gesturing toward, in his oblique and careful way, was not merely the survival of a person but the preservation of the possibility of a world. Ziusudra listened and understood. And when Enki's voice ceased, and the reeds fell quiet again in the warm evening air, Ziusudra did not panic. He did not run through the streets of Shuruppak announcing catastrophe. He did not gather his family in distress or go to the temple to argue with the gods or fall into the particular kind of human despair that comes from receiving news too large to absorb. He was a man who had spent his life learning how to receive the instructions of the divine. And this, however vast and terrible it was an instruction. There was something he was being asked to do, and he would do it. The construction of the vessel, the ark, though that word carries connotations from later traditions, was a matter of quiet, sustained, devoted labor. The texts do not give us precise dimensions for Ziusudra's ark in the same way that later traditions would describe the vessel of their flood survivor. What we know from Sumerian and Akkadian related traditions is that it was very large, vast in its scale, designed to endure water not merely as a boat endures water but as a sealed, self-contained world endures the obliteration of all other worlds. It was built of wood and sealed against water. It had a covering. It was designed not for navigation but for floating, not for going somewhere but for surviving the journey through nowhere, through the erasure of everywhere. Ziusudra organized his household. Those close to him who were brought into the preparation, craftsmen, perhaps, who helped with the building, family members who gathered and prepared, would have worked without full knowledge of why, following the directions of a king who moved with a quiet certainty that must have been, to those around him, both reassuring and strange. The work proceeded day by day. The wood was cut and shaped and fitted together. The seams were sealed. The interior was structured to hold what needed to be held. And as the vessel took shape on the bank of the river, rising gradually from nothing into something substantial, something real, something that announced by its very presence that the one who built it understood something that others did not, Ziusudra continued his rituals. He made offerings. He went to the temples and performed the proper rites. He brought the sacrifices and sang the prayers and maintained, through all of this, the posture of a devoted servant of the gods. Not in performance, in genuine acknowledgement that what was coming was not evil, but it was real, and the proper response to divine reality was not resistance but reverence. The animals came to the vessel. In the understanding of the ancient texts, this too was part of the divine arrangement, the creatures of the land and the air that would be preserved, gathered not because Ziusudra went out and corralled them but because the conditions were set for it, because the same divine intention that had sent the warning to Enki and from Enki to the wall and from the wall to Ziusudra was also ordering the world in such a way that the necessary things would find their way together. The skies began to change. In that part of the world, the sky is often enormous, a vast dome of blue or bronze depending on the hour, with clouds that build slowly in the heat of the afternoon and sometimes release brief, violent rains before the evening calm returns. Those who live close to the land learn to read the sky the way they read everything else in the natural world, as a text, as a set of signs that carry meaning if you know how to interpret them. In the days before the flood, the sky would have communicated something unprecedented. Something that all the accumulated knowledge of reading skies and reading seasons could not quite place, because nothing in human experience had prepared a framework for interpreting what was coming. The clouds that gathered were not the ordinary clouds of the season. The quality of the light shifted. The air itself changed, heavier, perhaps, charged with a pressure that had no precedent. And Ziusudra looked at the sky and understood that the time was very close. He made his final preparations. The vessel was sealed. The last of what needed to be gathered had been gathered. Ziusudra himself, and those whom he sheltered, and the living things that had come to be preserved, were inside. And the door was closed. What happened next was described by the ancient scribes in terms that are simultaneously cosmic and quiet. The waters came from above. The waters came from below. The great underground ocean, the Abzu, which was Enki's domain, released its hold on the earth, and the springs and wells that everywhere tapped into that vast subterranean reservoir began to overflow. And from above, the storm clouds that had been building for days released themselves in a way that no storm in living memory had approached. The winds came from all directions. In the Sumerian cosmological imagination, the four winds were servants of Enlil, expressions of his breath, agents of his authority. When Enlil chose to act upon the world through weather, the winds were his means of action. And now all four were sent simultaneously, the south wind and the north wind, the east wind and the west, each carrying its particular character of force, all converging upon the land between the rivers with a combined intensity that made the ordinary storms of the rainy season seem, in retrospect, like the gentlest of breezes. The rain fell in a way that erased the distinction between the air and the water. What had been sky became water. What had been solid earth began, slowly and then less slowly, to dissolve at its edges. The fields that had been so carefully tended, the irrigation channels that had been so precisely dug, the boundaries between the cultivated and the uncultivated that human labor had established over generations, these began to blur and then to vanish. The rivers rose. The Euphrates, which had always moved slowly and with a kind of measured generosity along its banks, became something unrecognizable. The water that had always been contained within its banks, that had always known where it was supposed to be, ceased to know. The banks disappeared. The river expanded not like a flood but like a realization, a sudden understanding on the part of all the water in the world that the boundaries it had previously respected were no longer in effect. The cities were overtaken gradually, and then all at once. Eridu, perhaps the oldest, either reeds around its edges went first, flattened and then submerged, and then the lower quarters of the city, and then the mud-brick walls that had stood for longer than any living person's memory began to soften in the sustained contact with water, began to lose their form, began to return to the undifferentiated clay from which they had been raised. Nipper, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sitpar, Shuruppak. One by one, city by city, the accumulations of human effort and human meaning were swallowed by the water. The temples went dark. The altars were submerged. The sacred objects, the tools of civilization, the implements of daily worship, the archives of clay tablets on which the knowledge of generations had been pressed, were taken by the water. The sound of the cities, which had been the cause of all of this, in Enlil's reckoning, ceased. Not gradually. Completely. What had been noise became silence. What had been the busy, lead, multiplying hum of human civilization became the sound of water moving over what had once been land, and nothing else. Inside the vessel, Ziusudra waited. We are not told, in the fragments of the text that survive, what the days inside the ark were like, what it felt like to be enclosed in that sealed wooden world while the world outside underwent its erasure. We might imagine the sounds of the water against the hull, the movement as the vessel lifted from its mooring on the river bank and was taken by the flood, not directed, not steered, but carried. A thing entrusted entirely to the movement of the water, which was the movement of divine will made physical. The ancient texts tell us that the storm raged for 7 days and 7 nights. This number, 7, is weighted with sacred significance in the ancient Near Eastern world. It signals completeness. The storm did not end because it ran out of force. It ended because its work was complete. What needed to be done was done. And on the 7th day, Utu rose. Utu, the sun god, the god of light and justice, came out across the sky, illuminating a world that was very different from the one he had last illuminated. What had been cities and fields and roads and canals and the whole complex infrastructure of human civilization was now a vast, still, reflecting surface of water. The world had been simplified, reduced, returned to something very like the state that existed before the cities were built, before the fields were cleared, before the first bricks were pressed from the fertile mud. Ziusudra broke an opening in the great vessel and let the light in. He fell to his face before the sun. He prostrated himself in the full and complete surrender of a person who understands, in that moment, the magnitude of what has happened and the gift, undeserved, inexplicable, vast as the water itself, of having been within the vessel instead of without it. The waters had to recede. This is not described with particular drama in the ancient texts. The recession of the flood is not a moment of triumph or action, but simply a continuation of the divine ordering. The world had been unmade to a degree, and now it was being remade, and the water, having done what it was sent to do, was finding its way back to where water belongs, into the channels and the rivers and the deep underground reservoirs, back within the boundaries that ordinarily contain it. The land began to emerge. Slowly, in the way that all emergence from water happens, edged at first, uncertain, the surface of the earth not quite sure yet whether it was earth or still water, the boundary between them wavering and shifting until, over days, the land reasserted its identity. Ziusudra's vessel came to rest. The animals within it were released into a world that was, in many ways, primordial again, swept clean, uncluttered, the accumulated debris of human civilization dissolved back into the soil. In a quieter register than before, in a world that did not yet have the noise that had troubled Enlil, living things moved once more across the face of the earth. And Ziusudra made sacrifice. This was the first thing. Before anything else, before assessing what remained, before beginning to plan for what came next, before even the most practical concerns of survival, Ziusudra performed the ritual that acknowledged where all things came from and to whom all things ultimately belonged. He sacrificed an ox. He sacrificed a sheep. He brought the offerings with the care and precision of a man who has been performing sacred rituals his entire life and who understood, now more than ever, what those rituals meant. He was not performing an obligation. He was expressing, in the only language available to him, the inexpressible acknowledgement that he was alive because something greater than himself had chosen to preserve him. That the vessel had floated because the water that surrounded it was, ultimately, an expression of divine will, and that divine will, in its complexity and in its wisdom and in whatever space existed within it for something like compassion, had also contained the intention of his survival. The smoke of the offering rose into the air. And the gods came. They gathered like flies over the sweetness of the sacrifice. This is the image used in the ancient texts, direct and startling in its vividness, the gods drawn to the smell of the sacrifice the way that small things are drawn to sweetness. It is a striking image because it is so completely unsentimental, so free of any attempt to make the gods seem more dignified than the text needs them to be. They had been waiting, perhaps, for the sacrifice, for the signal that a human being had survived and was performing the proper rites, for confirmation that the covenant between the human and the divine was still in place, even after everything. Among those who came was Enlil. And here the story enters a moment of real complexity. Enlil had decreed the flood. Enlil had assembled the gods and made the case for destruction. And now he looked upon Ziusudra, alive, standing before the vessel, the sacrifice still smoking on the altar, and understood that what had been decided in the assembly had not been entirely carried out. A human being had survived. The ancient texts suggest that Enlil was, initially, displeased, that the discovery of Ziusudra's survival felt like a violation of the decision that had been made. There is a sense, in some related versions of the tradition, of tension at this moment, Enlil confronting the reality that the decree of the divine assembly had been circumvented, however indirectly, by the wisdom of Enki. But something changed. Perhaps it was the sight of Ziusudra himself, this man who had built the vessel and gathered the creatures and endured the 7 days of water and had emerged from it to immediately perform the proper sacrifice, who had not tried to turn his survival into self-congratulation or personal triumph but had understood it, first, as an occasion for divine acknowledgement. Perhaps it was the quality of the offering, the sincerity of the devotion it represented. Perhaps it was the recognition, growing slowly in Enlil's divine understanding, that the survival of this one man was not the failure of the flood to accomplish its purpose but was, in some sense, the necessary complement to it. Because a world entirely without humanity would also be wrong. Not in a sentimental way, not because the gods loved humans with the warmth of parental feeling, but because the arrangement between the gods and the humans was part of the cosmic order too. The humans served the temples. The humans performed the rituals. The humans kept the sacred calendar and offered the sacrifices and tended the fields that fed the divine household. Without humans, the world would be unbalanced in a different direction than it had been before the flood. Enki spoke. He had his own argument to make, his own case for why Ziusudra's survival was not a betrayal of the assembly's decision but a completion of it, a correction of the correction, a restoration of the balance that even the flood, in its thoroughness, would have disturbed if it had been absolute. The gods deliberated. The moment hung, heavy with the weight of what had just happened and what was to happen next. And Enlil relented. He approached Ziusudra. And what he did next was not grudging or mechanical. It was the act of a god who had made a decision and was now making another decision, and was bringing to the second one the same authority he had brought to the first. He blessed Ziusudra. He and together, the air god and the sky god, the two highest authorities in the divine assembly, conferred upon this one surviving king of Shuruppak something that no human being had possessed before. They granted him life like a god's. Life eternal. Life as the gods live it, outside the ordinary span of human years, beyond the reach of the ordinary death that ends all human stories. And they sent him away. Not back into the world of the cities and the rivers and the fields, where the work of rebuilding would soon begin. They sent him to Dilmun. Dilmun. Even the name has a particular quality of distance and brightness. In the Sumerian imagination, Dilmun was a place of sacred purity, a land somewhere to the east, perhaps, or perhaps simply somewhere outside the ordinary geography of the known world. It was the place where fresh water welled up from the earth in perfect abundance, where the soil was clean and untouched, where disease and death and the ordinary deteriorations of mortal life did not operate. It was not quite paradise in the later sense of the word. It was not described as warm and lush in the way that some later traditions would imagine the garden from which human beings came. It was described as pure, as clean, as the first state of things before the complications of time and human use had introduced their inevitable alterations. In Dilmun, the sun always rose in the right way. The water that flowed there was always sweet and clear. There were no sick animals, no aging trees, no slow decay that attends all living things over time. There was a quality of the beginning there, not the beginning of human history, with its noise and its cities and its accumulating presence, but the beginning of the world itself, when the gods had first arranged things and found their arrangement good. To Dilmun, Ziusudra was sent to live there, in the company of his household, in the quality of the eternal that had been granted to him. And so the man who had survived the judgment of the divine assembly, who had been preserved by the indirect wisdom of Enki and the attentiveness of his own listening nature, was carried finally to the place where the great gods themselves had decided he belonged. Not in the ordinary world, which would be rebuilt by the descendants of others. Not in the span of ordinary mortal time, which would resume its counting in the years after the waters receded. But in Dilmun, which was outside of time, or at the edge of it, a place where the distance between the human and the divine had, for this one man, been permanently reduced to something very small. The world rebuilt itself. This is always what happens, given time. The water receded, as we have said, and the land returned, and though everything that had been built upon it was gone, the land itself was not gone. The soil was not gone, it was, in fact, renewed. The deposit of silt left by the flood would have been extraordinary, an enrichment of the already fertile earth along the rivers that was, in purely agricultural terms, a gift. The world that emerged from the water was, in some measurable sense, more capable of sustaining life than the world that had gone under it. New cities rose. New temples were built. The sacred institutions of Sumerian civilization, kingship, priesthood, the keeping of the sacred calendar, were re-established, this time with a divine authorization that descended from the gods to the human world through a fresh act of divine grace. The king lists record this as a new beginning after the flood had swept over the earth, when kingship was lowered again from heaven, the gift of governance reimposed on a world that had, for a moment, existed without it. The people multiplied again. Of course they did. That is the nature of living things, to fill the space available to them, to find the conditions that sustain them and to respond to those conditions with growth. The cities became noisy again, in time. The accumulating presence of humanity pressed once more against the margins of the cultivated world, once more against the boundaries of what the divine order had originally specified. But something was different now. Not in the external arrangements of the world, those would continue to be negotiated, generation after generation, through the complex ongoing relationship between the human and the divine that Sumerian civilization embodied and enacted. But in the memory, in the knowledge that had been pressed into clay by the scribes who received the story and understood its importance and gave it the permanent form that allows it to reach us, even now, across a distance of thousands of years. The story existed. The knowledge existed. That the gods had once decided the world was too full, too loud, too present with human presence, and had acted on that decision with the totality of divine force, and that one man had survived, not by his own power or cunning but by the grace of a God who understood the value of what was being lost and found, within the letter of the divine law, a way to preserve it. This knowledge was not comforting, exactly. It was not the knowledge of a world where humans were safe and protected and beloved. It was the knowledge of a world in which the relationship between the human and the divine was genuine, which meant it was a relationship in which genuine things happened, in which the gods had real power and exercised it, in which human continuity was not guaranteed but granted, in which every generation was, in some deep sense, living within the aftermath of the flood, within the world that survived because one man listened to what a god said to a wall. The tablets that carry this story are kept now in museums. They sit in climate-controlled cases behind glass, handled only by specialists wearing cotton gloves, their surfaces covered in the small wedge-shaped marks that the Sumerian scribes pressed into wet clay with the cut end of a reed. The marks have lasted longer than the temples they described, longer than the cities whose founding they celebrated, longer than almost everything human that has tried to last. There is something to sit within this fact, in the long quiet of the night. The rivers still flow. The Tigris and the Euphrates move today in approximately the same channels they moved in when the first cities rose along their banks. The land between them has changed, the southern marshes have dried and been partially restored, the ancient shoreline is now far inland, the cities that were once port cities near the Persian Gulf are now deep in the interior. But the water moves. It has always moved. It moved through the flood. It moved after the flood. It will move after everything that we have built has also, in its own time, been swallowed by whatever floods the future holds. The grain still grows in that soil, enriched by the silt of 1,000 generations of ordinary floods, the seasonal inundations that were always part of the rhythm of life in that part of the world, the floods that were not judgment but gift. In the years since the great myth was written down, the ordinary work of the rivers has continued. The soil has continued to receive what the water brings. The seasons have continued to turn. And in the clay, under the museums, under the excavations, under the modern cities that have been built on top of the ancient ones, the tablets continue to hold what they were made to hold. The wedge-shaped marks. The story. The names Enki and Enlil Anan. The reed wall that heard what a man was not supposed to hear. The vessel that floated when the world drowned. The sacrifice of an ox and a sheep at the edge of a renewed world. The God who relented. The man who was carried, at the end of all of it, to the place of purity and permanence. Ziusudra is in Dilmun still, perhaps. In whatever form the divine promise holds across all the years that have accumulated since it was made. At the edge of time, in the place where the sweet water rises without ceasing, in the country where the sun rises in the right way and the soil is clean and the long, slow deteriorations of mortal time have no purchase. He is there as the story is here, preserved, distant, somehow both ancient and present. A man who listened. A man who built. A man who survived by the combination of a god's oblique wisdom and his own patient attentiveness. A man who, when the water finally receded and the new world lay before him uncertain and silent, made sacrifice before he made plans. There is something in that worth carrying with you into sleep. Not a lesson, exactly. The Sumerians were not in the habit of extracting tidy moral lessons from their myths. More equality. A way of being in relation to things larger than yourself. An acknowledgement that the world is very old, and that the forces that move through it are beyond the full comprehension of any one person in any one lifetime, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is to be quiet enough and attentive enough to hear what is being said, even when it is not being said to them directly. Even when it is being said to a wall. Let the story settle now. Let it find its place among the other things you carry, the images you have gathered through your years, the stories that have shaped what you understand. This one is very old. Older than almost anything else that was written down and survived. It was told by people who lived in a world that felt, to them, as immediate and real and full of consequence as your world feels to you. They worried. They worked. They loved the people around them. They looked at the sky and tried to read it. They brought their offerings to the temples and hoped that the divine attention was favorable. They went to sleep at night under the same stars, though they understood those stars differently than we do, and they woke in the morning to the same sun, Utu, the sun god, and began again. They left this story. And the story has come, across an almost unimaginable distance, to reach you here, in this moment, in the quietness of wherever you are. The Tigris flows tonight. The Euphrates flows tonight. The land between them is dark and still under whatever weather moves across it. And somewhere in the soil, the traces of the oldest cities, Eridu and Nippur and Shuruppak, sleep beneath the accumulated weight of millennia, holding their shapes in the memory of the earth, which does not forget. Let yourself be carried now. Let the story grow soft at its edges. Let the names and the images blur gently, the way that all things blur at the threshold of sleep. Let the rivers find their rhythm, the slow movement of the water that has never stopped, the ancient current that began before memory and will continue after it. The world was made. The world was unmade. The world was made again. And the water, which was judgment and destruction and also the oldest element, the source of all life, the medium through which the world has always been reborn, the water still moves. Let it carry you, very gently, into the dark, into the stillness, into sleep.